I'm Lauren Zink. I am a PhD candidate in Biosystems and Biodiversity, a program offered here at the University of Lethbridge. I do my research in the Alberta Water and Environmental Sciences Building, which is a state-of-the-art facility allowing us to study a lot of aquatic questions with our aquatic research facility. My work is centered around understanding mixtures of contaminants in our freshwater systems in order to protect our waterways. So my research aims to understand how two common contaminants found in our freshwater systems, metals and microplastics, interact with each other, and subsequently how they may cause toxicity to freshwater organisms. A lot of people question why I'm studying water systems in southern Alberta. It's seen as, a relatively dry land, a semi-arid desert. But I'm originally from British Columbia. I've spent a lot of time in coastal areas, in areas where there are a lot of concentrated lakes. One of my family's favorite places to go is to our cabin up in the Caribou region. And in understanding how that lake has changed and in seeing it change over the course of my lifetime and the lifetime of my parents and grandparents, it really enveloped my passion to want to protect our waters, to be able to understand what pressures those water systems are under. And it was driven by my research supervisors, Dr. Greg Pyle and Dr. Steve Wiseman, to come to the University of Lethbridge in order to answer those questions and start my research journey. Our waterways are under changing pressures all the time. There are new chemicals being created in order to meet our consumer needs and in order to allow life as we know it today. And with the production of new products, there are naturally going to be new contaminants and pollutants into our freshwater systems. And one of those pollutants that has gained a lot of research interest in recent years is the idea of plastics. So we use plastics in everyday lives. If you think from the time you wake up until the time you go to sleep, there's likely a plastic involved or a plastic product involved in almost every activity. They are so versatile, they are so useful, and they're relatively cheap to make. So they have been widely adopted in a lot of different aspects of our lives. And one of the tough things about plastics is because they are so good, they're what we call a persistent pollutant, meaning that once a plastic is introduced into our freshwater environments, they stay there for a very long time. They break down over time into smaller and smaller pieces, but the plastic itself remains in the freshwater system. And as they break down into smaller pieces, we call them microplastics. Anything less than 5 millimeters, so to speak, is sort of deemed the microplastic range. And the concern specifically with microplastics is that they are what we call bioavailable, meaning that they can interact with organisms or species or creatures or critters that live within our freshwater systems. And the risk in that is that these particles can cause entanglement, they can cause a blockage, they could be ingested and cause a digestive blockage, or get adhered to the gills of a fish, for example, and cause a respiratory issue. And what we aim to understand is how are microplastics interacting with those organisms. And there are a lot of different researchers globally that are working to address that question in different ways. Now, where my research fills a niche is actually adding an additional dimension to that in the idea that microplastics can not only interact with the organisms, but they can interact with contaminants and pollutants that are already in the water. So microplastics, as I said, they're versatile, they've got a lot of great form, and because of that, they're also kind of a really good sponge, or we call them a magnet in a lot of cases, to some of our other contaminants like metals. So I work specifically understanding how metals and microplastics interact with each other, and then subsequently how these metal microplastic complexes are affecting our freshwater organisms. So when we are looking at the effects of contaminants on freshwater organisms, one of our umbrellas of questions that we aim to answer are how does this affect the physiology of the organism? So fish are a really good example. They rely a lot on their sense of smell to be able to find food, to be able to find mates, to know where their home location is. And if there is something impeding their smell, they can't perform these vital functions, and that can result in population health issues and ecosystem health issues as a whole. So behind me we have what we call an electro-olfactography rig, or an EOG for short, because that doesn't quite roll off the tongue very well. And what an EOG does is it allows us to measure whether or not a fish is able to smell a certain cue that we give them. So we can give them a food cue, for example, and we can measure how much they're able to detect and smell that food cue and send those signals to their brain to say there's food in this location. So we're able to physiologically measure that on fish that we've exposed to contaminants. So we are actually able to do this to an anesthetized fish, and we are able to even recover the fish after in a lot of scenarios where we can say, okay, can you smell right now? Back into the contaminant. Can you smell an hour later? And do that on repeat to see how this is changing over time, right? So a lot of our contaminant exposures are time dependent. So a fish may be able to cope being in a contaminated environment for a day, but maybe not 3 days, maybe not 1 week. So part of our research is understanding what the severity is over time, both in acute and chronic scenarios of exposure to these contaminants. So how are microplastics a sponge, or how are they a magnet to metals? Why does my research field even exist? So microplastics are extremely dynamic, right? We've talked about this idea that this big piece of plastic can break down into smaller and smaller pieces, and that all of a sudden it becomes bioavailable, it becomes something that can interact with our organisms. But along the way, while it is degrading, the surface of that plastic is changing too. Right? If we think about, if we find a piece of plastic, whether that be an old water bottle, for example, and we know that it's been there a while, it's got that sort of strange texture to it, it seems very fragile and very brittle. All of those characteristics that we can see and touch and feel are actually indicative of what's molecularly happening on the surface of that plastic. And as plastics degrade over time, they get what's called a negative surface charge, meaning that there are little particles and little ions on the surface of those that generally are negatively charged. Now, when we think about our metals, those are positively charged, and opposites attract, and that's where that magnetic force comes from, is the negatively charged microplastic and the positively charged metal actually being attracted to each other and then becoming a complex. In southern Alberta, Canada is actually one of the leading producers of metal-containing goods in a lot of different metals, cadmium being one of them. Cadmium is found in our rechargeable batteries, it is found in pigments, it is found in plasticizers and paints. And because we are exporters and producers, there are inherently times in which we detect more metals in our systems than some other nations. And furthering to that, we have a society where we have plastics integrated in our daily lives. And we don't necessarily have a lot of legislation, though it is changing, around the production of plastics and the manufacturing side of plastics. So where our local economy is really driven in my research is that we live in a world in which our urbanized areas are also areas in which we have a lot of our freshwater bodies. Lethbridge specifically, we have a lot of green space, a lot of parks integrated into our neighborhoods, and if we think about areas where plastics are likely to be found in our freshwater systems, we find that urban areas are the primary area where we see the most plastics. So when we think about those lovely lakes and ponds that we see from our backyards, there is potentially plastic contaminating those lakes as well, and metals from just our industrialized system. Talking about the production of new chemicals and the use of new chemicals, there is often a real rush to market. And we see this in a lot of different areas. It's not just plastics, it's areas of pesticides, it's areas of pharmaceuticals, where there is such a need that we are racing these products to market and we aren't doing the proper testing proactively. And so with two contaminants that have become ubiquitous, that are very persistent, that take a very long time to break down, if they break down, within our freshwater systems, it is very difficult to see a solution on the horizon without some very important research feats moving forward, and innovation, I think, is the solution that I hope to see, and I think that there are a lot of really great teams working towards that, and hopefully together we can come up with something. With microplastics being a really persistent pollutant, and metals are persistent as well, they tend to stay in sediments, they tend to exist in the water, and with seasonal fluctuations, all of these contaminants can change within these freshwater systems as well. So when we are thinking about our impact and how we can work to mitigate these, I think there are two areas generally in where we as individuals and as consumers can take action. The first is in responsible consumption. making sure that you are understanding the products that you're buying, making sure that you're buying products for longevity, that you're repurposing when possible and recycling when you do need to get rid of a product or to move to a new product, and being able to consciously be aware of how that is having an impact in the amount of manufacturing required, right? Plastics especially is a matter of supply and demand. Now, metals are ubiquitous in freshwater environments. That means that they are everywhere in freshwater environments. A lot of these metals are naturally occurring, and a lot of metals are essential, right? We think about copper, for example. We need at least some level of copper in our bodies in order to function, but there are certain levels that become toxic. And so while metals are ubiquitous, we tend to have a little bit more control as consumers around the plastic side of my work. So being very aware of that as a consumer. And if you do see any plastic pollution in fresh waters, please remove it. Please be very aware that if you don't remove a water bottle, for example, over time it will degrade into smaller and smaller pieces and join into my field of research, which is much more difficult to remove something less than 5 millimeters versus something greater. That is a great question. Reversing and correcting the issue of microplastics pollution is a research area in and of itself. There are many researchers all around the world working to understand if we can effectively remove microplastics, if we can aggregate them together, if we can use certain types of very special organisms to digest them. And unfortunately, that is still in its infancy. We don't have a solution right now, but what you can do is just be very conscious on the macroplastic realm at this point in order to try and curb while we figure out a plan for these microplastics. Lethbridge is home to very sensitive ecosystems. If we look down, for example, at the Elizabeth Hall wetlands, those ecosystems have a very specific balance that needs to be maintained in order to allow that ecosystem to function optimally. Now, when we have contaminants that exist within those systems and that are constantly changing within those systems, we can actually throw that balance off within the ecosystem. So with microplastics acting as a magnet to metals, we actually have the risk of metals becoming more concentrated on the plastic than they are in the surrounding environment. So in terms of local risk for us, that could mean that the ambient metal concentration, meaning what we would normally be measuring in the water on our routine samplings, could be well below a concerning threshold for us, well below our most sensitive species as having an effect. But when we look at the amount of metal on that microplastic, which can now interact with those organisms, that then changes whether or not it is toxic and whether or not we're seeing the effects of metal toxicity. So I would say that the dynamic nature of our contaminants is the most pressing issue in our current local economy. I've got many, many hopes and dreams. So what my research is just finishing up here in Lethbridge. So my doctoral program is coming to an end this year, and so next I will be continuing on academia. The goal is to remain in academia, become a professor, be able to not only mentor those that are passionate about research, but also teach those, and hopefully bring those two together to both merge teaching and research together to create well-rounded and holistic individuals to join our society. And I will be next moving to the University of British Columbia for a postdoctoral fellowship in the Chris Wood Lab over at UBC, continuing my work to understand how differences in water quality, shifts in our environment over time are affecting contaminant mixtures and their subsequent toxicity to freshwater organisms. So I will be staying in this realm of research, little bit of a shift moving to a coastal environment, but we'll certainly be staying on this path. I have been asked many times whether or not I maintain a blog or a Twitter feed or an X feed or a Facebook page, and I am so busy researching that I don't. What I would recommend is keeping up to date on the ResearchGate platform is a great one. LinkedIn is another platform that I'm active on, and being able to see new publications when they come out. The University of Lethbridge does a great job of highlighting faculty and student research that gets published, so keeping an eye out in U Weekly, for example, in community news areas for this institution while I'm here, and then moving forward into ResearchGate, everything is on there as well.